Hey everybody, I'm John VanDuzer, CPA and partner with James Moore and Company, and I'm here with Suzanne Forbes, our managing partner and fellow real estate team member. And today we're going to talk all about estate planning for real estate pros. Thanks, Suzanne, for joining us.
Thank you, John. I'm looking forward to today.
Yeah, so I thought we'd start with maybe trying to think through some estate planning best practices. I know one of the things I immediately advise all of my clients is that they should consult with their attorney, who will actually be drafting all of the documents. But maybe we could walk through kind of in general the things that you need to be thinking about ahead of time as you go into your go with your attorney and get your game plan together. So what are some basic estate planning documents that everybody should have or have considered?
Most people are aware of a will, and that's what you hear about. I have a will. And typically for our real estate clients, they have more than just maybe a personal residence or a bank account. And so generally they'll have some businesses, some real estate businesses, or interest in other partnerships or different types of entities. And so sometimes a will isn't enough. And what I like to explain to people is take Michael Jackson when he passed away, and it was all over the press. And so when he died with a will, but he did not have a trust. And so when you die with just a will, you have to go through something called probate, and that's a court proceeding. And what that court proceeding does is it makes your assets become public knowledge because you file these public records, and you have to have an executor or a personal representative that goes through all your assets, and it goes through probate. You have your attorney. I love my attorney friends, but they do charge you for doing that. And the will works. The assets will transfer based on the will, but what happens is it's cumbersome. So the next level up from a will is what we typically call a revocable trust, or sometimes you hear it called a living trust. And the key there is it can be changed as long as you're alive. It's a document that can be changed. You can change where the assets go upon your death. But what it does do is now your assets transfer by a matter of law, by a document, and they don't go through the probate process. So we would typically, what we'll have is you'll have a trust, a revocable or living trust, and what you'll have, your will say, if there are any assets that are not in my trust, that are in my will, they go into my trust. And now my trust tells my trustee, whoever I named, which normally would be comparable to a personal representative or an executor in a will, not always, but your trustee will now do whatever your trust says to do with those assets, which provides a lot more flexibility to your wishes. Sometimes when I talk with clients, I ask them, how much do you want to control what happens to your assets beyond the grave? Right? You want to reach up to the grave and say, okay, my son John, and I got John and Jane, and John is very conservative. I know that he'll take care of those assets and he'll use them the best way. But Jane, she maybe isn't as conservative and spends it all, or maybe she's married to somebody that I don't particularly like, and I think that maybe they're going to try to take the money and go spend it, which sometimes we see. I can put rules in that trust document that says, well, Jane doesn't really get the money until certain things happen.
Yeah, or you could be in my case, my kids are 10, 6, and 2. So, any sum of money at all for a 10-year-old, they're not of the age of, being legal. So they, would have to be in a guardianship. And so the trust allows you to bypass a lot of those. Some other kind of estate planning documents you'll hear sometimes is like a durable power of attorney. And there's a few others that really kind of talk about, if you're incapacitated or you're in a coma, who has right over your medical decisions. And I think these are also really important kind of in that whole conversation. But really, when you look at your finances, you kind of have three options, right? You can die without a will, and then you're rolling the dice on whatever the courts decide, right? You can die with a will, and at least then you can somewhat spell out who gets what and how it's handled, but then still it's a court proceeding, as public record. Or you can put your assets in a revocable trust, which when you pass away, the trust kicks into gear. There's no court proceedings. The trustee, can take a death certificate and the trust agreement and take control of bank accounts and everything else. And so it really provides a much more seamless transition, as you go into your, after your life and your heirs kind of take over. So I've had a lot of friends that go and they, oh, go ahead.
I want to mention, you mentioned the durable power of attorney. So I had an interesting situation with a client that was a business owner, and he was the only one that could sign on the bank account for the business, and was in a very serious car accident and became incapacitated for a period of a couple of weeks in a coma. And I realized that nobody else could sign on that bank account. They could not make payroll because they didn't have, there was nobody else that could sign checks or access the bank account. And you're talking sometimes a couple of weeks before you can get a court proceeding to be able to appoint somebody. So that made me realize how important a durable power of attorney is. So a power of attorney is used while you're alive, but you can't act on your own behalf. And a lot of times we think about death. We think about, okay, if I die, what happens? But we don't think about well, what if I become incapacitated? I think it became aware with, some of the things with going on with the pandemic, and what if you got on you were put in ICU and you couldn't function? Is there somebody else in your business that can pay bills and make payroll and access your bank account and keep your business running while you're incapacitated?
So we're going to talk about transition planning and contingency planning, and that's going to be our second video, so tune in. But that's exactly the thought process here when you're considering these things, is what happens, if there is an untimely death or being incapacitated, and how can you make sure that things can continue on? So keep on going through this. So I've had friends that they go and they get a revocable trust set up. They take it home, they put it in their filing cabinet, and they forget about it. What kind of problems come up when that happens, Suzanne? Or what's the number one problem with revocable trust?
So the number one problems with a revocable or living trust is you actually, for them to be effective and to work, you have to title the assets in the name of the trust. So if I go set up a trust, and it's the Suzanne Forbes Family Trust, and then I don't change any assets that I have to the title to say Suzanne Forbes Family Trust, and it just says Suzanne Forbes, when I pass, they go through my will and not through my trust. So we call that the funding of the trust. The asset, that's a technical word for you have to change the title of the assets to the trust, or the ownership of the assets. So if you own an LLC and you hold your real estate in an LLC, and now you need to, and it's just the LLC interest is owned by John VanDuzer, not John VanDuzer's living family trust or trust dated whatever date, that is not considered being in the trust, and it will have to go through the will again. And so you haven't done anything. So what we try to do with our clients is, do you have a trust? Should you have a trust? And if you don't, then let's consider it. Let's get with an attorney. This is legal, but let's get with an attorney, let them know what your wishes are. And then if you do have a trust, how are your assets titled, or who owns your assets? Because if they're not owned by your trust, you might as well not even have that trust. Now, sometimes the trust will have other documents, and I mentioned in the will, you have a pour over will where all the assets will go into the trust, but that defeats the purpose. It's really number one problem with trust is the assets, or the ownership of the assets, don't get titled in the trust.
Yeah, so it's the equivalent of that gym membership I bought and then didn't go for years and years. It's something that's super important that when you actually set all this up, that you actually execute on the plan that you've set up. And part of that is making sure all your bank accounts that need to be in the trust are retitled, that all the membership interests are assigned to the trust as ownership, and that you really dot all the I's and cross all the T's to make sure that this plan will actually work.
Yeah, and John, your gym membership, what we also see sometimes is that first month in your gym membership, you go faithfully, right? So when you set up the trust, you title everything properly. Everything you own the day you set up the trust, you title properly, because you're a faithful gym membership. You're going to lose weight. You're going to do this right. And then a year later, you haven't seen that gym. And so a year later, you're buying new assets and setting up new LLCs, and you don't title them in the name of the trust. So sometimes we'll see that. We'll see in the very beginning, they're done right. But then as time progresses, you forget, and you're buying new assets or acquiring new interest or whatever, and those don't get named in the trust.
Yeah. And so that kind of is a good point, you know, and kind of going into our next point is, you know, one of the things that we also suggest is how long ago did you get all this set up? And when was the last time you actually sat down and just reviewed everything and make sure that it all still makes sense? You know, make sure that whoever you did name as trustee still is a good person for that role, or even beneficiaries, or you know, any number of circumstances. Take a look at your assets and make sure that, like you said, you're not creating new LLCs and putting your name and kind of going around kind of that plan that you set up. And you know, you've been in the CPA business for a long time. I'm sure this is something you've seen.
Yeah, I actually had a situation with a client, and these are unfortunately war stories that they were a fairly new client to us. We had met with them. We had talked about, they did have a trust, and this was early on in my career, and I didn't get a copy of the trust, and I didn't remind them consistently to make sure that they made sure they updated the trust. Well, circumstances had changed, and they had gotten divorced, and there was a spouse's name, an ex-spouse on the trust as beneficiary, and a lot of things. And this particular client went to help a friend during Christmas, put up Christmas tree lights in a tree, fell out of the tree, broke his back, punctured his lung, and passed away 10 days later. And the trust document had not been updated for probably 20 years.
Yeah.
It was quite, it was very emotional. It was difficult. Luckily, the family worked fairly well together, all things considered. And I think at that point was when I realized how important, and I swore to myself, I don't ever want that to happen again, because that's why we have these type of conversations, to educate our clients and the people that are out there. Make sure that you are reviewing it. Circumstances change. Kids grow up. They get married. You have divorces. You have other family. You have new marriages with blended families, and all of that needs to be looked at. Which is why the revocable trust is important, because you can update it and change it,
Yep.
versus what you hear as an irrevocable trust, which is another type of
where it's locked in.
document.
Yeah. And then in addition to trusts and really looking over the terms of the trust, what are some other things that you should be looking at and updating regularly?
I think it's really important to look at your total estate value. You want to look at what life insurance do you have intact. I remember I went to Stetson, and my law professor at Stetson said, what's the most important insurance you can have? And of course, we're all college students. We said life insurance. And he said, no, you're dead. You're not costing anybody anything. And he actually said disability insurance, because when you become disabled, you have a loss of income, and you typically have more expenses. I think as we look at, you need to look at your insurance coverage. What is your life insurance coverage? What is your disability? What if something happened to you? We'll talk about contingency planning later, but what would be the income sources? Would they continue? Would you need to have some disability insurance? And another area is long-term care insurance. And I'll mention that because a lot of people aren't big fans of life insurance, because they're like, I'm dead. I don't really, no, I'm not costing anything. But a newer product that's out there in the market that I actually really like is, there's a life insurance, and it has a component of long-term care. So that if you have to go in a long-term care facility or need long-term care, you can actually draw on that life insurance while you're alive to pay for that long-term care, which I think can make a lot of sense in certain circumstances. And so I think that's a newer planning opportunity out there that we should be looking at. In addition to looking at your life insurance and your disability and your long-term care, there's always the asset protection piece, especially for business owners that have significant assets that may be beyond insurable limits, or other things. And you want to make sure, do you have your assets, if they're in the trust, or do they need to be in an LLC? Do they need to be a multi-member LLC? Are they joints with survivorship? I mean, all of those things, which you really need to get with an attorney. That's something that we work with the attorney on, to see how you title them and whether there would be any tax consequences to how you title those assets, which there are definitely tax consequences on how you title assets. So the attorneys are great, they go protect you from an asset protection, but they may be triggering an adverse tax consequence that you're not aware of. So which is why we both have those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And in real estate especially, I think this is especially relevant because, if you're developing and you're guaranteeing debt, those are personal guarantees that, and contingent liabilities that at one point in time you may have to make good on, right? And so it's really considering your wealth and your risk appetite and saying, hey, are there things that we could do from an asset protection standpoint that if I have to make good on these guarantees, it's not catastrophic for my overall finances. So that's definitely a concern we've talked with our clients about, and really advise them to talk to a competent attorney to work through these issues and really come up with a plan that makes sense. So you're balancing the actual estate planning, will, trust, those sort of things with make sure, do I have enough life insurance to, in an event of an untimely death, or do I have disability and long-term care insurance so that way if I don't die, which can sometimes be worse, is that also going to be taken care of? So these are all things really we consider best practices. And so I think we've about run out of time for this conversation, but we're going to continue the conversation on transition and contingency planning. I think this is a really important topic as well, so I hope you can join us. See you guys.
Thank you, John.
To learn more about James Moore & Company's real estate accounting and business solutions, go to jmco.com. And don't forget to subscribe to our Real Estate Industry Update series to receive updates when new videos are released. If you'd like to be a guest, or if there's a topic you'd like to see covered on a future episode, contact us through our website or email us at info@jmco.com. You can also follow us on social media for more news as the landscape of real estate continues to rapidly evolve.